All
No.
right.
Very good. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our November Beyond Black History Month. I hope you're here because you saw our notice, so you know this exciting book that Marian Black Ruffin's going to preview for us and discuss. But let me hand this to our education chairs, Jean and Linda. I see Jean. I don't know what happened to. I see Linda. Don't see Jean.
Well, actually, we're both here, but my name says Gene Crump and his name says Linda Crump because we're using each other's computers tonight. So that's the only difference.
I'm so confused.
It's okay. You're fine.
Let's proceed.
So I just want to do a couple of housekeeping things before we start. We did record, so everybody knows that it'll be up later. It helps a lot if you can mute where you are, because that way we won't get any background noises. And we're going to, if you put it on the speaker view instead of the gallery view during the session, it's better. And so I'm going to go ahead and put mine on speaker view. And I hope everybody knows how to do those things. And I have the honor to introduce our speaker this month. It's Marian Black Ruffin. And all of you, I am sure when you hear her name, the first word that jumps into your head is technology, technology, technology. And I have to admit that Marian sent a wonderful bio about her tech background. And I'm only going to read one thing from her bio. And then I want to tell you some other things about Marian. So don't be afraid, Marian, okay? You're absolutely fine. I won't say anything bad about you. But she retired from Oracle as a senior strategic consultant. And what impressed me so much was that she was able to use marketing strategies to combine with data from advertising, social media, email marketing channels to show clients how they could really speak to their clients in new ways. And that's the kind of tech savvy that Marian has. But there's more to Marian than just technology. From talking to her on occasion, I can tell she was a very curious child, because I know some stories about her getting into a little bit of trouble while trying to learn how to work on a car with her dad. I know she's clever because I've talked to her about some stories about how she really engaged her students when she was teaching Spanish. Many of you might not know that Marian, it was a Spanish teacher. And my parenting skill story that I absolutely love, I wish I was that clever when I was raising my children. She knew how to combine math with time out. Now that's really unique. So tonight we're going to have the pleasure of hearing Marian talk about a wonderful book. And I'd like to turn it over to you, Marian, and I will make sure I share my screen when you tell me you're ready.
Okay. All right, you can share the screen.
Okay.
Never Caught was a book that caught my eye. My neighbor down the street loaned it to me, and I started reading it, and I was just couldn't believe it, that a slave on a Judge Staines was able to run away from the President of the United States. That in and of itself was compelling. But before I get into that, I'm going to introduce, you can change the slide. I'll introduce the book's author, Erica Armstrong Dunbar. She is degreed from Columbia University, 2 of her degrees. Her first book was A Fragile Freedom, African American Woman and Emancipation in the Antebellum City, published by Yale University Press in 2008. She also received awards, Blue and Gold Distinguished Professor of Black Studies and History at University of Delaware, recipient of Ford Mellon and Social Science Research Council Fellowships, Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer, and she is currently at Rutgers University. She's been there since 2017. Just a second, I need to make this smaller. Okay. The author was compelled to become a writer when 42 years ago, her mother asked her, well, it wasn't asked, she told her that she would watch Roots. Roots was based on Alex Haley's novel. It was seen by over 100 million viewers and received 9 Emmy Awards. It was a story about the indoctrination of Kunta Kinte. He became a household name. It received criticism. However, with the Black family, it was a story that had never been seen before, and they were engulfed in it. And they found pride in it, and it compelled the author to become a writer. Next slide. She told of how. Next slide.
I'm trying to, but for some reason,
Oh, that's okay. I'll
the
keep going.
admit part is not allowing me to do this. Did you admit them?
Yes.
Okay. You know, computers are wonderful when they work.
I'll keep going. You catch up.
Okay.
So on President's Day, she mentioned that our grandkids draw silhouettes of our presidents on President's Day, most often including George Washington. And most kids are told the story that George Washington chopped down a cherry tree and he told his father he would never tell a lie.
I'm trying.
However, George Washington told many lies. And this book about Anna Judge is at the heart of the story about our president's character. Even though it did not spark a musical like Alexander Hamilton, who owned slaves as well, it is still nevertheless important. Anna Judge ran away from the mansion of the President of the United States, the most powerful man in the country. She mustered the strength to run away because she was a slave, but she listened and she learned. She ran away because she wanted to be free. She left, but the President of the United States could not let her go. And he pursued her from the day until he died. And we're going to answer the question why. Next slide. Why do we know so much about, backup one, two? One, okay, good. Why do we know so much about forward one?
Linda.
Can you go forward one? Okay.
What?
How did the author find out so much about Anna James? I'm sorry, Anna Judge. Because she gave interviews to two reporters at the end of her life. She lived to the age of 75. The first interview was with Thomas Archibald. He was a writer for the Granite Freeman in May 1845, almost 49 years after her escape. The second interview appeared in 1847 on New Year's Day in The Liberator, the nation's most powerful abolitionist newspaper. Most likely, this was the only existing 18th century narrative of an 18th century Virginia fugitive. The author knows as much detail about her because Anna wanted to wait until everyone who had helped her had died. She told her story to be sure there could be no retribution against them at the age of 75. Now I'm going to ask you some questions because I used to be a teacher. These are simple ones, and anyone you can take your phone, your Zoom off of mute right now, and anyone can answer the question. Next slide. What was the author's name? Anyone?
Erica
Dunbar.
Armstrong Dunbar.
Right. What TV series had a big impact on the author and influenced her to write?
Roots.
Good. What enslaved character in that TV series was indoctrinated into slavery, and did he lose his identity?
Kunta Kinte.
Kunta Kinte.
Did he lose his identity?
Toby. Yes, he became
Yes.
Toby.
Yes. And you answered my trick question was what what was the name his slave owner gave him, which was
Toby.
Toby. Good. Okay. Next one. Next slide. Now let's view Anna Judge's family tree. At the middle of the slide, you'll see Betty. We don't know Betty's last name. She likely wasn't given one. But She's at the center of Anna Judge Staines' family tree. To the left of the tree, you'll see that Betty had 5 children. Austin, who gave birth, Charlotte, his wife, gave birth to 4 children. Thomas Davis, Tom Davis, and Betty Davis, who were born somewhere around 1769, 1771. To the right, we have Andrew Judge, Anna Judge Staines, who married Jack Staines. Anna had 3 children. And then Philadelphia Costin, who married William Costin, who was a free man, and Jack Staines also a free man. Now, the author says that all her children were light-skinned. This indicates that there were interracial relations. The author cannot conclude that there were consensual relationships. However, it also indicates that there were perils for being a Black female enslaved human being.
Mhm.
Philadelphia could have also been Judge's daughter. He left the plantation around 1780, around the time when Philadelphia was born. Andrew Judge was an indentured servant, and he would have met Betty at the time prior to Washington becoming the general of the troops. Next slide. Now, Andrew Judge gave Anna Judge her name. The records at Mount Vernon said that Andrew Judge created the blue uniform worn by Washington when he was named Commander-in-Chief of the American Forces. It didn't say he created it. It says he created it. It didn't say he sewed it. That's where the relationship between Betty and Andrew likely was cemented. Betty was a weaver, she was a seamstress, and she was a tailor. So she likely is the person who sewed this uniform. The records don't say she did it, but she was likely a person who did it. When he left 1780, his indentured servant fees were paid. He lived in Mount Vernon. He's the only judge in Mount Vernon. So therefore, it's concluded that he was the father of Anna Judge Staines and Anna Marie. She's the only person who had a middle name as a slave, and her name was Gaelic and African in nature. She was often referred to as One, which would have been like my nickname was May versus my name being Marion, or Mary as Lois calls me. Next slide. Now let's meet Anna Judge. Next slide. Anna Judge was freckled. She was described as mulatto, thin, small build, born somewhere around 1773, 1774. The reason why we don't know exactly when the slaves were born or when they died is because George Washington and Martha Washington didn't keep very good records on their slaves. They didn't really care. At age 10, Anna was brought up to become a seamstress and a spinner like her mother. She becomes Martha Washington's favorite slave. And it was said that Martha wrote that because she was unseen, she knew how to be unseen. It was written by Robert Lewis that on the day of the departure of Martha Washington from the plantation, the slaves were agitated and much affected by her departure. But perhaps they were agitated because their families were being separated from their mother, from their wives. Their children were being sent off to who knew where, because the slaves had no idea where they were going. They weren't talked to or spoken to. They just knew that they were leaving. And the departure was extremely upsetting. Perhaps Betty would reconcile herself that Austin, her son, and Anna would be together. And that's all she could do. She had no freedom. She had no say in it. She had to accept it. The life of a slave was difficult. She would get up in the morning and she would work. She would sew until sundown. Sun up, sundown. That was the life of an enslaved person. There was no 15-minute break in the morning and a 15-minute break in the afternoon, no lunch break. She worked until evening, and they got whatever was left over. That's where the entrails from a pig, chitlins, where pig feet, pig tails, whatever was left over was given to them. And that's where they learned to cook those the best they could. Washington leaves to go to New York. New York was the first seat for the presidency. And when he left, he had to borrow money because he had had a bad crop year. He had no money to travel. So he had to borrow money at interest at 6%. But Anna was not afraid. She was encouraged to go north. And this is where she encounters the first free Blacks, is in New York City. Next slide. When Anna Judge goes to New York City is 1789. She's 16 years old. Next slide. The fire to maintain slavery stayed lit well into the 19th century. And New Yorkers grappled with Black emancipation. Governor George Clinton owned 8 slaves. Aaron Burr, 5 slaves. Involved in the New York Manumission Society were John Jay and Alexander Hamilton, who also owned slaves. They had many conversations about ending slavery, but they were uncommitted to this goal. Slave ownership was still a sign of upper class status, so slavery in New York lived on. But in the 1770s, religious groups began to rethink slavery. The Quakers in Philadelphia moved to abolish slavery, and the Anglicans started to educate and baptize Black New Yorkers. Next slide. Now I'm going to ask you some questions again, the school teacher in me. And you can ask me questions at this time. How many children did Betty have?
8, 7,
Nope. Nope.
3.
10.
Betty had 5 children.
I know.
Who made General Washington's uniform?
Possibly Betty.
Betty.
Possibly Betty. Who was likely Philadelphia's father?
Judge.
Yes. Which enslaved person had a middle name?
Ona.
Ona. Ona Marie Judge Staines.
Mhm.
Okay, any questions so far for me? So, next slide. So Philadelphia was the first, New York was the first capital, if you will, for a presidency. And in 1790, it was decided that Philadelphia would be a better seat for the United States. And they moved it to Philadelphia in 1790. They purchased the largest house, next slide, in Philadelphia. It was located on High Street or Market Street. And this was the picture of the residence of Washington in Philadelphia. They made modifications to the house, and it was determined that 6 slaves that traveled from Mount Vernon could not run this home. So Thomas Lear set out to find white help. After modifications, it was written that Martha was pleased with the home and its design. And she began to settle into her role as First Lady. She began to entertain dignitaries' wives, have teas, and Anna began to sew her gowns, bathe her, care for her hair, and take care of her. She would listen but could not speak, as the First Lady would complain or would talk about being happy. Anna could only listen. As a slave, she could not speak. Next slide. Well, soon her happiness, Martha's happiness, would soon be shattered. The Attorney General came to see them, and he told them that 3 of his slaves had run off. It turns out that they came to him and gave him notice that they were claiming their freedom. Martha was upset because how could this be? Tobias Lear, April 5th, 1791, Washington's secretary, roused deep concerns for the president because he told him in Philadelphia, in 6 months, your slaves will be emancipated. Washington first argued that can't apply to us. We're the president and first lady of the country. He said, not only your young slaves are affected, but your adult slaves are affected as well. Well, then Washington and Mrs. Washington, Martha Washington, came up with a plan. And they decided that they would rotate their slaves to Mount Vernon every 6 months. Austin had been there the longest, so they sent Austin back to Mount Vernon on his own with $11.66 for the trip. They weren't even concerned about him running away, most likely because he had a wife and children in Mount Vernon. He would be happy to get back home. They took a trip with Anna and the other slaves to New Jersey, who had different laws, and that reset her clock. During this time, in March 1st, 1780, there was a monumental piece of legislation that was passed in Philadelphia. Slavery until 28 years old. That was middle age for 18th century slaves who had torn muscles, broken bones. They would be deeply affected by this because no one cared about a slave who was 28 years old. Most slaves didn't live beyond 40 years during this time. Next slide. So for 5 years, from 1791 to 1796, they transported their slaves back and forth from Philadelphia to Mount Vernon. The president gave money, gifts to the theater, to the circus, to his slaves, i.e. $1, which was sizable amount of money. But Anna Judge was smart enough that she only went to the circus, she only went to theater occasionally. The money that was given to her, she hid it. You'll find out why. 3 years before Judge's arrival, a group of free blacks, including Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, came together to form a free African society. Inevitably, Anna Judge became acquainted with free blacks. Some helped her flee. She would find time for herself. Whenever the Washingtons were entertaining, she would go out into the city and she would talk to the free blacks. She would engage with them. And it's likely when she found out about the law. It's likely when she found out about the emancipation. However, she couldn't act on it. She felt that she would be a slave for the rest of her life. So what was her life like? So between sewing and weaving gowns for Martha, caring for Martha's grandchildren, and doing domestic work in a crowded home, Ona Marie Judge had very little time for herself except for those rare occasional excursions. And even these were painful because the plays were about white freedom, not about her life. The circus was a white circus. And it made Anna think, could I run away? Could I be free? Next slide. In 1793, yellow fever hit Philadelphia. Between 4,000 and 5,000 Philadelphians perished, including the wife of Tobias Lear, the secretary to the president. Blacks thought that they were immune to the disease. They were wrong. However, they thought this was a way to be accepted in white society. This backfired on them. They were accused of impropriety during the outbreak, and when the outbreak was over, lynchings, riots, burnings happened. The Washington household packed up and left Philadelphia for Mount Vernon. They didn't return until December 9th, 1793. Anna James, Anna Judge was happy that she was able to see her mother and her family, was sad again to return. She had no say again about it. She had to go back to Philadelphia. Next slide. As things settled in again to a routine, a letter appears, and Martha's peaceful life is shattered again. Next slide. Elizabeth Betsy Park Custis. Betsy writes the Washingtons and informs them, not asks them, informs them that she's getting married. The man she has chosen is not only 24 years older than Betsy, but he's a British businessman. Now, you can imagine how this would be taken in the society that the Washingtons, the circle that they're living with and socializing with. He's not only British, but he's had children by an Indian woman. He's 24 years older than Betsy. And Betsy has a foul temper and hard to control and did what she pleased. Three things against them in this letter. So Washington writes a letter back to Betsy, giving her their approval to marry Thomas Law. And Martha bequeaths Anna Judge to Betsy Law as a wedding gift. A mistake that Martha didn't even realize she was making, because this incensed Anna Judge. Anna Judge had begun to believe she was being accepted, perhaps being even treated like a daughter, but not really. She realized that her life could be upended at any time. She asked herself, what would her life be with Thomas Law? Would he rape her? Would she be safe? And with Betsy's temper, would she beat her? Would she be treated fairly? And this is when she began to contemplate running away. Next slide. Anna Judge ran away in 1796 at the age of 22. The ad that was placed was the ad that the author came across. 9 years she was working on this book. Because she came across this ad, she asked herself, who was Anna Judge? Who was this woman who the president put an ad in a newspaper to get back? Who was this woman who ran away from the most powerful man in the country? A runaway slave from the house of the President of the United States at the end of the 18th century. And this started her search, her research on Anna Judge. At the age of 22, she ran away because she learned that she was going to be sent back to Virginia as a wedding gift to the granddaughter of Martha Washington. And Anna began to plan. Now, this move that Anna made, this forced the president to show his will and skills to catch Anna Judge, which he failed to do. Next slide. But 3 years before this, before her runaway, he wrote the Fugitive Slave Act. It was as if he wanted to make sure his slaves knew. Now, remember, he knows that they can, after 6 months, be freed and emancipated. So he writes the Fugitive Slave Act. There's a question if his wanting to keep Anna Judge is purely because of money, because if she runs away, he would own the Custis estate, Martha's estate, or is it something else? There's nothing here in the book that says that it is, but it made me wonder. This is the core of what his character really was like. If you read this act, I highlighted the words that lead me to believe this man had no soul. A slave owner or his agent could legally seize a runaway and force the apprehended slave to appear in front of a judge or magistrate in the locality where he or she was captured. After written or oral proof of ownership was presented by the slaveholder, a judge could order the return of the alleged fugitive slave. Now, Southerners read into this that it meant that they could cross state lines. There's nothing in there that says that they could, but they decided that they could. On the judge said, whilst they were packing up to go to Virginia, I was packing to go. I didn't know where, for I knew that if I went back to Virginia, I never should get my liberty. This is when she decided that she had to leave. Next slide. So May 21st, 1796, on a judge escapes. She had made clothes for herself and hidden them away. She had hidden money away in a house with no privacy. They likely were in the attic. That's where the slaves would have been. There was no insulation to protect them from the cold in the winter, no insulation to protect them from the heat in the summer. The house had multiple slaves. She could not share her plans to run away with them because out of jealousy, they would have told. So she waited until the Washingtons retired to the parlor for wine, and Ona Judge slipped out the Washington Manor into the free Black community of Philadelphia. It was written that Absalom Jones had been in the house, had been in the manor. Maybe he had signaled her. Maybe there was a conversation. But in anyway, she got her instructions from Free Black Community of Philadelphia. Nothing was written down. It was by word of mouth. After she left the house, 2 days later, an ad was placed. Next slide. It read, absconded from the household of the President of the United States on Saturday afternoon. Ona Judge, a light mulatto girl, much freckled with very black eyes and bushy black hair. She is of middle stature, but slender and delicately made, about 20 years of age. To tell that she was absconded, save face for the president. He also told everyone who would listen that it was a French boyfriend or a Frenchman who stole or absconded with Ona. The president's ego was deeply bruised. One of his slaves had run away. Not the first one, but Ona Judge had run away. All of his friends had seen Ona standing silently by the president's wife. She had served them tea. She had served them crumpets or scones. She had been beside the president's wife from the beginning, so they knew who she was. They knew what she looked like. This was deeply embarrassing for the President of the United States. Next slide. The ad went on to say she would likely go to the Delaware River. Warned all who worked on the dock she may attempt to escape by water. She may try to pass as a free woman. Has money to pay her passage. Washington realized his gifts would have helped her run away. He offered a $10 reward to Black or white slave catchers. Ona did escape by boat. In an 1845 interview, she said that long after Captain John Bowles was dead, she told the name of the captain who saved her life in her journey to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. She said, John Bowles welcomed me on board. He took my money, said very little to her, pointed to her to go below deck. She came up on deck after they launched with other passengers. No one said anything to her. She said nothing to anyone. And when they took this 5-day journey, the smell of the smell of the water made her feel that she was free. Next slide. Now, as Anna settles into her life in Portsmouth, we have to note that human bondage disappeared by 1805 there. It wasn't until 1857 that New Hampshire abolished slavery. Ona Judge had only one job that she could do, and that was domestic work. She suffered from acute insomnia. She would wake up in nightmares. She had to train herself that she was safe in order to sleep. She began to save some money. She wanted to start to sew again. She even talked about being able to buy ribbons, bows, and buttons so that she could begin to sew and sell her dresses to other women. She had begun to imagine a life for herself as a free person, but she knew she was a slave and she had to keep watch for herself. And one day on one of these trips, as she was buying food for the woman that she was working for, she runs into Elizabeth Langdon, a senator's daughter. Elizabeth Langdon had come to the house on Market Street. She had played with the the grandchildren of the First Lady, and she knew who Ona Judge was. She told her father, who felt obligated, of course. The law told him he had to tell the president. And August 21st, 1789, the Washington knew where to find Ona Judge. Now, Washington had to navigate through changing sentiments toward owning human property in the North. He wanted to do it discreetly. This was a word he used over and over again. 6 letters were written between Washington and the Secretary of the Treasury, Oliver Wolcott. And Wolcott hired Customs Officer Thomas Whipple. What were they going to say to Washington? No, we're not going to help you. He was the President of the United States, even though he was coming close to the end of his term. Washington, always cash-strapped, thought moving Ona by boat to Alexandria would be the least expensive thing to do. They complied, and he told them again about the story of her being captured or absconded by a Frenchman. And Whipple went to negotiate with Ona Judge because he wanted it done discreetly. Next slide. Now, he concocted this story about a French lover. Ona realized the story was a trick because there was no French lover. Whipple told her he was an ally and not an enemy. Ona found her strength and said no. Under no circumstances would she return to slavery. Now, Whipple could have tied her up, put her on a wagon, but he didn't. He would not try to capture Ona after that because Whipple's feelings about slavery had changed. He was no longer on the side of the president. He was on the side of the Federalists, and he no longer believed in slavery. And neither did, I can't think of his name now, Langdon. So Ona was safe again. Next slide. So Washington's no longer in office, and he's back at Mount Vernon. Ona Judge is now married to Jack Staines, a free Black man. Jack Staines goes out to sea, and it was dangerous because it was the Caribbean. And in the Caribbean, he could have been captured and turned to a slave again, and the ships were being raided for slaves because it was illegal to bring slaves to the United States, at least part of the United States. So Washington employs his nephew, Burwell Bassett Jr. Look at that face. Is that a face you would trust? So he goes to capture Ona Judge Staines, but the president used that word again, do it discreetly. Now, Ona is suffering because Jack Staines dies. They bring his body back. She buries him. She doesn't have a husband any longer, and she is desperately poor. Bassett, however, goes to the house. They negotiate. Ona tells him no, she's not going with him. He goes to tell the president, and in the meantime, she gets help from Langston, who tells her, Langdon, he assists Ona Judge to evade Burwell Bassett. He tells her to leave, and Ona runs to Greenland. Now, when Bassett returns for her, which to me was strange, like she was going to wait for him, she's no longer there. So he goes from house to house, and they tell him, well, she went south, she went west, but they never tell them that she went to Greenland. And he never finds her. And he goes back to Virginia in October 1799 without Ona. George Washington dies December 1799. Before he dies, he emancipates one of his slaves. In his will, the one that they told Martha to keep, he gives all of his slaves to Martha. Martha emancipates George Washington's slaves December 1800 because accidents began to happen around the plantation. She wrote that there were accidents. Actually, they were setting fires, and she was concerned about her life. There had been uprisings in several parts of the country, and she had heard about them, so she decides to emancipate George Washington's slaves. Martha dies 2 years later after burning letters between her and George. She didn't want anybody to read them. And she never emancipated her slaves. Instead, she shared them with her grandchildren. Next slide. So, married to Jack Staines in 1797. He was a free black man. Ona Judge had 3 children. They all passed before her. Out of necessity, she sells her 2 daughters out as indentured servants. The domestic work was backbreaking, literally. And both of her daughters died from it. Her son went to sea to follow his dad. He never returned. Ona's only regret was leaving her family in Mount Vernon. She stated that it was a sacrifice, but she would rather be a free woman, choose her own husband, raise her own children, than to go back to slavery. And even though she was living in abject poverty, even though she had to sell her children, her 2 daughters, she would rather do that than to be a slave. If she had only known that her sister Philadelphia lived a good life as a free woman, it would have offered her peace of mind. Next slide. Well, these are questions that you can ask me.
Well, I'll go ahead and start, and I think it is interesting. What was George Washington's problem with his power of ownership?
I believe that George Washington, he could not accept ever that one slave, even though he had other slaves leave, that one slave was able to run away from him. And so therefore he had to continue to pursue her. And I believe that because she was so tiny, how could this tiny young woman run away from me? And how he could not capture her just was something that ate at him until the day he died.
Okay, looking at George Washington's ad for the runaway slave, why could he not accept that Ona Judge could think for herself?
How could he think that she could think for herself? She was a slave. She was a slave that had been cared for. He was a slave owner. From his perspective, even though they barely fed them, she was better off as a slave than a free person. How could she run away?
And why do you think he kept pursuing her for so long?
I believe that he had a wife that was on him constantly saying, bring her back. That was one reason. And he was embarrassed was the other reason. I mean, could you imagine being in a circle of friends that would keep asking you, did you ever find on a judge?
And the last one I'll ask before I open it up is, why didn't he get her back?
I think that Anna Judge was clever. She used her common sense and she listened. All those years of standing next to Martha, they spoke in whispers, but Anna heard what she needed to hear to escape. And she planned well. She made dresses in her off time so that she would have the clothes to fit in to society, so she would look and appear as a free woman. He knew it, but he couldn't do anything about it. And I think that's why he could never get her back.
Before I open it up to everyone else to ask questions, I see Lois already has her hand up, but one of the things I really enjoyed in reading this book, and if you get a chance, read it because of the way it's written. You know, the author puts into a lot of the text of her writing to help you understand what's going on at that time. And Captain John Bowles had to have been an ally because a woman would never be traveling alone at that time. And here she was aboard his ship, and he has her go under so that she won't be caught and people won't know. So again, I just wanted to throw that in. I'm going to go to Lois Wilkins first. What would you like to say, Lois? Or ask?
I was also wondering, perhaps maybe she went into the role of passing because these were all light skinned. So, you know, her already having the acclamation for speaking properly and knowing the pretty much the common language amongst white women. She made her own dresses. Maybe it was possible that she had the bonnets too. You never know.
Possible.
Not question.
What do you think, Marion?
I think it's possible.
Okay.
But the author said that she didn't pass. I believe the author indicated that she had the hats. You were right, Lois. But she was light skinned, but I don't think she was light enough to pass.
And I think,
Yeah, but you know, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just wondering because a lot of times Black people recognize light-skinned people, whereas white people actually sometimes don't recognize.
That's true. That's true.
I
That's
think
true.
the next hand up was Fran Taylor, and then after that, Dana Cunningham.
Hi, I was the one who had the question. Was she literate? Did she ever learn how to read and write?
No, she was not literate.
Okay, thank you.
And Dana?
I was just wondering if maybe there was a sexual relationship between Washington and Ona, and that was part of his impetus for wanting her back so badly.
Yes. I
mean,
wondered that
very
too.
common.
It was common. And he had several slaves that he slept with. We know there are books out there about that. None of them mentioned Anna. And the author said there was nothing written, but I wonder if that was really why he was pursuing her the way he was pursuing her.
Another thing I recall from the book and reading it is that her sleeping quarters were really right outside of where the Washingtons were sleeping.
Yeah.
So again, it put her in a very, very precarious situation when it came to her own personal safety, which is something that they allude to that she would have worried about the entire time. So we don't really know the answer to that.
You know.
Any other, oh, Jean, a question?
Marion, do you think with the number of writers coming up now, that there are going to be more books written about African Americans from an African American perspective?
I believe there will be. I hope that there will be, because that's what we need. We need more research. there are many more Anna judges out there. There's many more stories. And with the proper research, we could uncover more narratives, like Dana's family, and write books about them. Anna, Erica Dunbar has written a child book for children. And I bought books to give as part of Masala Giving Circle. And I didn't buy that one. I'm gonna have to go and buy that one too, because I think the more we can get the truth out there and open up their eyes and they can see writers, maybe they will encourage some child to also become a writer, like Erica Dunbar became a writer.
David, I noticed you put some stuff about yellow fever in the chat. Do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Marion was saying about the outbreak in Philadelphia, specifically Philadelphia. It wasn't so much that the people of color or the Africans thought they had immunity. It was Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a well-known Philadelphia doctor and ultimately an abolitionist, and really became quite an advocate for particularly free people in the community. But that error in his judgment led to many more deaths, certainly among people of color, than would have been the case. In fact, Africans do have some immunities to malaria, for example. But yellow fever, this was not malaria. So, and the upshot of that, of course, was Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, who were collaborators of Dr. Rush, rallied the Black community to help, believing they had this immunity. So many more Black folks died, but they went into homes and actually helped the ill and helped remove the dead. And so provided a great service, but afterwards there was a really critical editorial written about the complicity of Black folks in this. And so Jones and Allen wrote a paper refuting that, and it was supported by Benjamin Rush. So it's an interesting time.
You know, it's interesting you say that, David, because believe it or not, my son, who is already 40, but when he was a child, it was believed by the person watching him that he wouldn't get chicken pox because he was Black. So those things have not gone away. I think I saw Alvin Sout raises his hand. What would you like to say?
No, I was just going to comment on that same vein that David was talking about, that Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, I mean, they really did drum up a lot of African Americans to assist the whites during that yellow fever. And Benjamin Rush, I was reading in a book about Hamilton, that Rush's theory, even though he was a renowned doctor of the time, to heal the yellow fever was largely by bleeding people, which was a popular technique used at that time, but also giving them the equivalent of enemas and so forth to clean them out. And people became so debilitated. That's part of the reason why so many people died. But of course, at that time, no one was blaming him. It was more so that somehow, Blacks were spreading it around. And the other thing I was going to raise, if I recall correctly, there was a male Black slave of Washington. His first name, I think, was Hercules.
Yes.
And he was a chef, and he also escaped.
Yes, he did.
So I just wonder if you think, Marion, that perhaps the fact that Washington was having trouble holding on to some of his better slaves that he viewed as property, that added to his motivation to go and spend so much time and money trying to recover Ona Judge.
Yes. In fact, Hercules was a well-renowned chef. And he was such a good chef that at first he had told the Washingtons he would not run away because of his son. He was concerned about his son. But as his son got older, the Washingtons forgot about him because they weren't concerned about him. They gave him money, he was well dressed. And in fact, on the day that his 6 months was up, he and his son both went to the Washingtons and said, "We're leaving." And they were so shocked that he left. And he started his own restaurant. He became well known in the free Black community, and whites frequented his restaurant.
I think Linda has her hand up.
Thank you. So there were, well, the one thing I couldn't quite follow was, when did Ona come back from Greenland? And I want to comment that, how do I put this? All people have to face the times they live in, whether they accept or rebel or somewhere in between. But I think I heard you say that in order to stay a free woman who needed money to survive, that Ona Judge sold her daughters not into slavery, but indentured servitude. I did hear you say that, yes?
Yes, she did.
So that was how she made do with the
Yeah.
times that she lived in.
She was in such, there were women, they were living together, and they had so little money
Yeah.
that she had no other choice. She felt that that was all she could do. And her daughters were it. And so they could bring money home. She could not feed them any longer. They didn't make enough money to feed them. So she had to sign them up, so to speak, for indentured servitude. The work was backbreaking. Think about carrying a cauldron of water for
No.
the day. It was torn muscles, broken bones. It was horrible. And they died from it.
Any other questions? I think if we're done with the discussion of questions, I think Dana had something she wanted to say in general before we closed up.
I am mentoring a young lady who is being homeschooled, hoping to return to Booker in the next semester. And we got into a conversation, and I told her about the class that David and several of others of us presented at Booker. And she was wondering if there was any possibility that that class would continue.
David, who went to the school board meeting yesterday, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, there is certainly that possibility. I think with the, I won't say the pandemic is still an issue, although I think I know that volunteers are being allowed back in classrooms so long as they've been vaccinated. And so again, I know that there are some groups, some of our Boulay folks are still going in, doing some of the work that they were doing in career development. We need more volunteers. We need some teachers. My wife has told me I'm divorced if I go back teaching right now with everything that's going on. So, but we need some more volunteers, and so I'm hoping some of the folks on this. I know that Edna Sherrill would love to have us back. So we want to do that. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? I think we're almost at the end. I want to first start with, let's give a round of applause to Marion. What a great book. What a great presentation.
Very
We so
outstanding.
enjoyed it. And if you think you know everything about this book, you don't. Read it. You will really enjoy the way the author has laid out the story. Marion tried to give us all the highlights so we'd know and understand the background of what's going on, but there's still a lot to know and still a lot for you to find out. So I hope you'll do that. We will have another Beyond Black History for Kwanzaa coming up in December. Is there anything, Lois, that you'd like to say before we sign off?
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Many of you on the call today, first of all, thank you, Marion. Thank you, Mary. Thank you. That was outstanding.
Well done.
That was
Well
that
done.
was outstanding, and I just I want everyone to hear that she worked very hard at doing this, and delivered it stellarly. So thank you. The other thing I would like to just ask each of you, if you are planning to participate on the Kwanzaa in the community forum and the Beyond the Black History Month, I am in search of some youth to actually do some program, the gifts to the elders portion of the Kwanzaa. So if you have young grandchildren, I have already reached out to the Crumps for some donations from their grandson, who is a poet, author, or I guess both. But I'm also looking for some readers. And I will also specifically ask my friend Ray, who knows how to do hip hop. I have a few books that are written for children, but I don't know how to read these in hip hops, sing songs. So I may ask you to do that. But if you do have some students or grandkids who can call in, it'll be on Zoom. Just send me a little note or send it to Linda or Jean so that I can include them. I'm trying to get this wrapped up pretty soon, the program, so that we'll be able to do that.
Thank you so much, Lois. And, you know, we'll go into the next year doing this too. Alvin, you have a group that's coming up pretty soon, and we'll keep going on. Do you want to say anything forecasting into the next year about what you'll be doing?
I think I'll let people keep guessing what it is.
All right, they'll have to
It
wait.
is a theme about education and issues in education at this time, using someone who's got quite a bit of expertise in that arena.
Thank you so much. And again, if you have ideas of things that we should be doing, we welcome any ideas. Like I said, we started this, all of us believing Marion was all about technology and only technology. And now we know she's a whole lot more than just technology. And we love her, and we're blessed that we have her in our community. I want to thank everybody, sign off, and David, you can stop the recording. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Wonderful job, Marion. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.